So we've got, lucky to have the Chief Exec here, Kurt, and he will take us through for about the next 20 minutes before tea about some of the impacts on the tourism industry that might come from Brexit. Kurt Janson, thanks.
Great, thanks for that introduction. I'm going to talk about the impacts of Brexit on tourism. I'm going to mostly talk about inbound tourism because that's where the impacts are really going to be. To talk about this, the importance of the EU when it comes to tourism to the UK is quite profound. 38 million people come to the UK each year as tourists, which is a fantastic number. It's one of the highest in the world, number 6. And for an island destination, that's quite something. But moreover, of that 38 million people who come visit the UK each year, 25 million of those come from the EU. So 2/3 of the visitors to the UK come from the EU. So this is going to impact on them quite significantly. Those visitors that come to the UK each year spend £23 billion in the UK economy. This is the second largest export earner in the services sector after the financial sector. So finance, then us. If you look at across goods and services, we're about the 4th largest export earner to the UK, so it's quite something. Of that 23 billion, 12 billion of that comes from EU visitors to the UK. You can see that while it's 2/3 of the number of visitors, it's only about half the expenditure, and that's because a lot of people come for short stays from Europe, whereas if you're coming from New Zealand, Australia, other destinations, long haul, you tend to spend longer over here, so your spend is higher. So, inbound tourism creates 450,000 jobs in the UK. Those are full-time equivalent jobs. There's actually much more in total because there's a lot of casual work in the sector, but if you crunch it all down to full-time equivalents, 450,000 people. And 250,000 of those are related to visitors from Europe. So it's incredibly important that we maintain access and encourage visitors from Europe to continue to come to the UK. I should like to say that in the £12 million spent by EU visitors to the UK, about £3.5 billion of that is actually spent in rural areas. So it's actually quite a few of them who get outside the M25 and visit rural destinations. And it's a growing trend as well, helped by things like Farmageddon, which is just released last week. But it's all encouraging people to get into the outdoors in the UK. And so the recognition of that has been increasing in recent years. Interesting enough, when the referendum was first held, Tourism Alliance held a survey of all its members. So we represent businesses in the inbound sector, the outbound sector, domestic sector, attractions, accommodation, transport operators, you name it. So we went out to them and said, give us your top 3 concerns about Brexit. And the really interesting thing, no matter what sector the people were operating in, they came back with 3 main concerns about Brexit. They wanted to retain connectivity, to get people in and out of the country and around. Access to employees, that was a real critical concern of them, is that, okay, if we're leaving Europe, where are my employees going to come from? And to ensure funding. There is a lot of EU funding that comes into tourism. This comes in 2 main ways. The structural funds, which tend to be focused on areas that depend on tourism. So key recipients of structural funding end up being places like Cornwall and in Wales. So if we lose funding from that, then those areas will suffer. Also cap payments. Very high level of cap payments goes into rural areas, obviously, but into the tourism businesses that operate in rural areas. I'll go into a little bit of that later. So let's tackle each of these areas in turn. Connectivity. Some good news. We have an aviation agreement signed with the EU, which basically means that air services are going to continue as they are at the moment, whatever happens with Brexit. So no deal Brexit, planes will still fly tomorrow to all the places that they used to fly. That is all completely sorted. So you may hear some myths about, certain services will stop. that is actually a myth. Other good news, all coach services will be unaffected. Well, almost all coach services are going to be unaffected unless you want to get a coach to Andorra, then you've got a problem, or to Moldova, or to Switzerland. Switzerland, the ski season, that's going to prove a problem because you can't, if we have a no deal Brexit, take a coach service from London straight through to Switzerland. And there's going to be no visa requirements for EU nationals and no requirement for UK nationals to have visas to go to Europe. So basically the flow of people will continue just as it is at the moment with no particular requirements to do anything. However, you will obviously need to have a passport that is valid for 6 months when you travel. And there'll be continued access to e-passport gates. So if you've got anyone coming in from Europe, they will still be able to use the e-passport gates to get into the UK. So they won't have to wait at desks to come into the UK, which will help with processing time. So that's good. So there's a lot of good news on keeping the flow going. There's also obviously some bad news. There is considerable uncertainty regarding ferry and Eurotunnel delays, and that's because of the mixture of freight and passenger transport at the ports of entry. There is a huge amount being done at Dover especially to make sure that there aren't any problems, but until it happens we won't know whether that's how successful that's going to be. We've also got the problem that the government has said it will stop the use of national identity cards for European nationals coming to the UK. At the moment, Pri Patel is wavering about when she's going to stop this, so it's a little bit unknown at the moment. That's affecting people coming in at the moment. It's also affecting, or specifically affecting school groups, because a lot of young people, especially children in the EU, don't have passports, they just have national ID cards and they travel on those at the moment. So parents are getting fearful that if they allow their children to come over on a trip to the UK, we go out under a no-deal Brexit, whether their children will be able to go home.
Do you know why do they say they're stopping?
There's varying degrees of security that come with national ID cards. Some of the European national ID cards are quite secure. They have biometric data built into them. Others, for countries like Greece, for example, are basically a printed piece of paper that anyone can forge, and they've got a lot of problems with trying to identify what is legitimate and what isn't legitimate. So, as it is, we're still going to be able to use national ID cards, or people will be able to use them to come into the UK, even under a no Brexit scenario, but how long it lasts after that is open to debate. We've got word from government that they will at least do it to the end of this year and then take a view about when in 2020 they will stop them. European sentiment is decreasing for the UK as a destination. This is coming out in the IPS figures. Latest one is going to be released on Thursday this week. But basically what we're looking at is various European markets are down by about 5 to 10%, especially France and Germany particularly badly hit. Some of the others not so bad, but depending on which market you're operating in overseas, this can have quite a big impact on you. What we're also finding is that if you are a visitor to the UK whose travel needs are complex, you're more likely to be either cancelling a booking or delaying your decision about whether to come to the UK. So, for example, if you're on a package tour, you'll probably come over here just fine because you're part of a package tour and someone's looking after you. If, however, you've decided to come over with your touring caravan from the Netherlands, then you've got to figure out about whether your caravan will comply with UK legislation once we leave, what driver licence you need. If you've got your pet in the back of the caravan, what's going to happen with passports for pets scheme. There's a whole lot of complexity that comes into your travel arrangements, and those people who have complex travel, for example, people with caravans, more likely to delay coming over to the UK. So that market will be hit, or is being hit at the moment. So, yeah, insurance, driver's license, pets, all that type of thing is really causing people concern. Also, different age groups. I mentioned children who come across on national ID cards, also finding that if your market is elderly people generally more nervous travellers, and therefore they're putting off their travel to the UK as well. Right, on to employment. Again, you know, we did the survey back in 2006, what's your most pressing concern about Brexit? It was employment. Did another one recently, and recruitment and retention is still the single biggest priority facing tourism businesses. This isn't helped by the government introducing the immigration white paper, which has a 30k threshold for people being able to come and work in the UK. UK Hospitality, which is the Hospitality Trade Association, so all the hotels and restaurants in the UK, did a survey of their members, found that between 85 and 90% of the people who work in that sector don't earn £30,000, which is concerning on 2 points. But where that goes is that there's only about 12% of people who work in the tourism industry at the moment who are EU nationals. So you think, yeah, okay, that's not too bad. The problem is that over the last 3 years, 45% of the new people working in the tourism industry have been EU nationals. So as the unemployment rate has decreased in the UK, so our need to get people from the EU to work in the industry has increased. So if we basically pull the plug now, that's going to have a huge impact on future recruitment needs. And even now, I'm getting reports from businesses saying that they're having to compete in the marketplace more readily than they used to. They've had to increase their wages, but they're not increasing their prices or productivity. So basically, their margins are vastly reduced. And again, this is businesses that run on a 3 to 5% margin. UK Inbound, which is the Association for the Inbound Tourism Industry, recently did a large piece of work with the University of Canterbury on what would be the impact if we had the immigration white paper come into effect in the UK with a no-deal Brexit. What would happen to the tourism industry? Amongst a whole lot of data they got back, the single biggest finding was that 65% of businesses said the threshold would impact their ability to continue to operate. That's not continue to operate at a lower margin or a lower productivity, that's continue to operate. Now, they may have been overplaying, but if you even halve that, you'd still get a third of businesses saying that they would find it difficult to survive with that type of immigration scheme. So that's a real concern for the industry. And to top that off, the new Boris Johnson government has decided that they will take the immigration white paper and evolve that into a points-based immigration white paper based on Australia. Now, there's some good bits about that. They give points for youth, points for knowing languages, points for soft skills of certain dimensions. However, the word is that the government wants to keep the 30k threshold and put that on top of the new points-based scheme, so that's going to cause real problems. There are some solutions. In the immigration white paper, there was a bit that talked about expanding the youth mobility scheme to cover the EU. Now, I don't know how many people know the youth mobility scheme, but it's a scheme that by which various countries like New Zealand and Australia, if you're a citizen there, if you're aged under 30, you can come across the UK, work for 2 years without needing a work permit. So you can just get on a plane, come over, work in pubs and Earl's Court, and then go back again. I did it, it worked really well. The government is minded to expand the youth mobility scheme so that it covers the EU. What we're pushing with the government at the moment is instead of 2 years by your 30, it should be 4 by 34. allowing someone to come from the EU for 4 years would encourage businesses in the UK to provide them with training rather than just use them as a disposable asset to churn every couple of years. It also provides companies with the ability to select the best and the brightest that come over and make sure that they get to that 30k threshold so that they can remain in the UK during that period. And I think that's got a lot of hope of plugging some of the gaps in the workforce that we're going to have. Good point is that language skills is to be added to the occupational, well, we hope that language skills is going to be added to the occupation shortage list. We've had a number of conversations and the government officials have been quite shocked about how much the tourism industry relies on people with language skills. They didn't quite understand. Yeah. Basically, everyone can speak English, can't they? Yeah, yeah, that's not how customer service works. So we're also talking to them about whether any proposed salary threshold should be regionally set, because obviously London is a far different beast to the rest of the UK, and rural areas especially will struggle to get anywhere near the 30,000 limit. To be fair, discussions aren't going well on that one, basically because the government's pushback is that someone could be employed in a rural area and then just shift job. So they don't want to go down a regionally set parameter. And basically the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the government's go-to committee on how we should get people into the country and what the threshold should be. We think that they should undertake quarterly surveys to ensure that tourism businesses are not adversely affected. Basically, keep monitoring the sector to make sure that we have the people with the skills that we need to provide the world-class service that we need to provide to attract all those visitors to the UK. Right, and funding. As I said, tourism is a significant beneficiary of European Structural Investment Fund programme. And as I said, a lot of that goes outside places like London into rural seaside areas and therefore benefits the tourism industry in those areas. That needs to be retained. Also, there's 3.1 billion of CAP funding allocated to environmental schemes. You know, these schemes are absolutely essential to maintain the quality of the rural environment that we need to attract visitors to rural areas. And £400 million of that scheme is actually available to rural businesses. Interesting to know that tourism businesses in rural areas, the number of employees is twice as many as people involved in agriculture these days. And the contribution to the economy in rural areas, tourism at the moment, trying from memory, contributes something like £18 billion to rural economies, and agriculture is about £12 billion to rural economies. So the rural economy is a tourism economy these days rather than an agricultural economy, and that's the message we're trying to get through. So in replacing these schemes, we need the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is going to be replacing the structural funds, and the Agricultural Bill, which was just announced in the Queen's speech. These initiatives need to take account of the impact of rural tourism in rural areas and on the rural economy. So that's where I see the impacts being, in general terms, in the tourism industry at the moment. As ever, you should always end on an upbeat note. So I'm going to go through a couple of opportunities for you. Package travel regulations. Anyone heard of them, know of them? No. They're the bane of my life. They are the most ill-considered piece of legislation I think I've ever come across in my life. And you know, you have some of the Brexiteers going, when we leave the EU, we'll be able to get rid of all this EU red tape, and no one can actually think of the EU red tape that we want to get rid of. This is it. This is the one we want to get rid of. Because basically, it stops accommodation providers working with outdoor industry people like yourselves in rural areas. For example, if you had a B&B that you want to work with, you said, come and stay at my B&B for £100 for the night, and we've linked up with a local horse riding outfit who'll take you on a tour up into the hills. If the person falls off the horse, it's the B&B owner's fault, okay? They get sued, not you for providing, or whoever it is that provide the horse ride in the first place. So all the risk stays with the accommodation provider because they are the senior partner in it. They sold the product. So there is no way that they want to actually get involved with any activity which has a risk factor in it to provide an added value product for their customers. It is such a real bind on people working together. There's also a huge amount of legislative requirements that underpin any small package like that in terms of the information that's got to be given to the customer at various stages of the journey. Also, if the customer, for example, had that package of stay at my B&B for £100 and go for the horse riding, that money from that can't actually go into their bank account. It's got to stay in an accrue account, and it can't actually be accessed until the person's come and stayed and gone home again, and no dispute has arisen over the package provided, which just kills the actual cash flow of small businesses. So again, it's another reason why no accommodation provider really wants to get involved in providing added value products. So if we get those, I've done some calculations which worked out that it would increase rural tourism by about £2 billion a year just by getting rid of that package travel regulations at no detriment to the consumer whatsoever. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse. It also provides an opportunity, if we have a no-deal Brexit, to revise state aid rules on funding. At the moment, they're quite strict. We could change that. That could have a really good impact on the development of tourism businesses in rural areas. And we could remove double taxation on domestic air travel. This is another great bit of European legislation that you've got to treat passengers the same wherever they are within the EU. So basically we have a thing called air passenger duty. So if you fly to Malaga on holiday, you pay £14 air passenger duty. That's fine. But the rule has to apply equally to everyone. So the rule in the UK is if you take a plane leaving a UK airport to any country in the EU, you pay £14. If you decide to go to Inverness because you want to go into the Scottish Highlands, you're paying £14 twice because you've got to pay it to get up to Inverness and you've got to pay it to get back down from Inverness. But of course, if you're going to Malaga, you only pay it once because you're only leaving the UK once. So basically, this tax encourages people to travel overseas on holiday rather than to travel domestically in the UK. We could get rid of that and actually redevelop our domestic aviation network so that we can get more people out of London and into the regions. The other good opportunity is all this uncertainty that we've been talking about has the potential to boost domestic tourism. We saw with the global economic crisis that there was the emergence of the staycation. And the reason for the emergence of the staycation is because tourism in the UK is incredibly price sensitive. So if the pound drops by 1%, all things being equal, the amount of revenue that we should get from overseas visitors coming to the UK increases by 1.3%, which is quite a significant boost. So if we fall or go with a no-deal Brexit, the pound will invariably go down. That will boost inbound tourism to the UK, great. However, on the outbound side, with the cost being so much higher from going overseas, that same type of effect will happen on the domestic market. You'll get it'll be much more likely that people will stay in the UK. We will have another staycation boom on the back of a no-deal Brexit. Not quite the reason I'd like people to stay in the UK. I think we've got kind of great attractions and resources, and they shouldn't need to be go through an economic crisis to visit them, but it will invariably help if that happens. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Kurt. Questions for Kurt on tourism?
Just a quick one. Do you have any insight onto what the future might hold in terms of reciprocal medical care, for instance, the e-hit card?
Yeah, at the moment the e-hit card falls by the wayside. That will be gone. We are telling people, and the government advises us to tell people that they need full travel insurance to travel from the UK to the EU or vice versa. It may be that a version of the e-hit card is negotiated into kind of the new trade agreement with the EU, but if we fall out, it's gone.
Showed a chart about immigration and being there's a stark downturn. What are your members saying? I mean, like, have you seen real data showing the level of supply going down and the wages going up, or is it just a lot of worry at the moment?
I'm getting a lot of anecdotal information from businesses saying that they're having to put up their wages and they're finding it difficult to attract the staff. Heard of various bits from People First, which used to be the old Skills Sector Council for the tourism industry. They're putting the number of long-term vacancies in the industry at about 30,000 at the moment. So that shows you the level of want in the industry for people from overseas.
Yeah, just a very quick one regarding the travel in and out of the UK. You said that you're anticipating some jams on the borders. I was under the impression that due to the UK not being part of the Schengen agreement, that would not change at all, because you have what is it called again? I see these guys every week. Forgot their name. Immigration control, border force. That's exactly
your friends. Yeah.
So, is there anything to expect there to change for the worse?
No. What I was trying to get across was if you're travelling by air, there shouldn't be too much of a problem. There could be on the outbound if you're a UK national going into the EU. In theory, you've got to be asked if you're a third nation, a national from a third nation going into the EU. What's the purpose of your trip? How long are you going to be there? Have you got the money to support yourself while you're here? All that type of thing. I travel on my New Zealand passport. I'm very rarely asked that at all when I travel into the EU, but it is there that they should be asking those type of questions. I don't think they will, unless, for example, Spain decides to be nasty to people from Gibraltar.
To annex Gibraltar.
Yeah, they could ask those type of questions and really slow down people going from the UK, going through EU ports of entry. Yeah, I don't think they will. It'd be a result of a political dispute if they decided we're going to work to rule on this. What I was trying to get was that we have freight and people travelling through the same port of entry. That's where the potential problems are going to be caused. Not through the people, but through the new procedures that the freight's got to go through to get in and out of the country. So although for Dover they put a lot of work into Operation Brock, which is a hell of a lot better than the previous version. They learned from their lessons from that. And they're going to prioritise passenger transport over freight transport to get people through. There is still the potential that things will happen and there will be delays, which we can't discount. So those are going to be the blockage points if there are any. At the airports, yeah, should be absolute.